Welcome back. This lesson is on intercultural communication competence, and we're going to look at some factors and variables that we can work on to enhance our competence. We'll look at obstacles that get in the way of becoming interculturally competent, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the outcomes of intercultural competence and then some of the communication behaviors, both verbal and nonverbal, that can affect our intercultural competence. So let's dive in. Remember, we talked about the idea that culture has an objective level and a subjective level, or a conscious level and an unconscious or subconscious level. And the things that are above the surface on this iceberg metaphor are things that we can observe and we run into, we notice on the surface. And those are cultural aspects that are important, and we'll be able to see culture in those things. But it's the parts of culture that are below the surface, the subconscious or subjective level of culture, that constitute the things that we usually trip over in our intercultural interaction. And that's when we know that we've begun entering into an intercultural space, is when those things like values and logic and myths and legends and different ethical positions and just nonverbal aspects like the use of space or proxemics or the time differences. So those are things that we trip over and encounter in our interactions, and they then culture becomes salient, and we're in an intercultural space. That's a concept that we introduced several lessons ago, that when culture becomes salient in our interaction and causes a difference in the way that we see or understand the situation, that all of a sudden we are in this intercultural space. Now, what we're going to try to do in terms of achieving intercultural competence is know how to navigate those spaces better. So let's use a scenario to kind of get us into what are the variables, or I call them aptitudes, that you can work on, you can be aware of, and you can work on in order to increase your intercultural competence. So let's watch this scenario, and the question for you is, what would you do in this scenario? How would you act?
You're in a bar in a foreign country. It's been a nice warm day. You fancy a refreshing drink, but none of the waiters seems to notice you. You wait and wait, but nothing happens. What do you do?
All right, so that's the question. What do you do in this situation? Maybe you speak the local language, maybe you don't. Maybe it's the first time that you've been in this country. So the question is, what action do you take? You've got some options, right? You could wait and you could just be patient and see what happens. You could sit back and observe other tables. How are they dealing with this situation? Are they getting served? How are they getting served? So you could just be patient and take a sit back and wait approach, but you've been waiting for a while and you've been trying to get the server's attention and it's not been working. So that's a question. So another option that you could explore is maybe if there's a table nearby, you could find out parle anglais, you could ask, do they speak some English? And then if they do, you could ask them, it's your first time at the restaurant, how do you get the server's attention? Do you order somewhere else? Do they come to the table? Often the way service is conducted in other cultures is very different. For instance, in Europe, in many countries, the server does not befriend the clientele like they do in a U.S. restaurant. Oftentimes in a U.S. restaurant, the server is very friendly, very energetic, they chat you up, and the idea is the more friendly they are, the better the tip will be. But in Europe, often there's a standard gratuity, it's included in everybody's check, and it is not the server's job to befriend you, and so they won't chat you up. And often they can come off as sort of distant or unfriendly. And so those differences occur across cultures. So is that one of these situations? Or do you get up out of your seat and approach the server and just ask them again with the same maybe conversation is, I'm new to this restaurant. Is there somewhere where I place my order? Can you help me? And so you could ask the server director. So one of the first things we have to think about is that intercultural competence is an impression about message behavior. And there's two variables here. One is appropriateness. Are we acting, communicating appropriately for the situation? For instance, we know that in U.S. culture that you communicate one way in a hallway or an office at a school, but when you're in the library, you communicate differently, right? You're supposed to keep your voice down and you have to whisper because people are concentrating and reading and studying in the library. So we have to be quiet in the library. And so that's just one appropriateness difference based upon a context, and all contexts are different. And then we also want to be effective. So there's appropriateness and then there's effectiveness. Sometimes I can be effective without being appropriate. Like I could come up to that server in that restaurant and I could say, look, I've been waiting for 20 minutes and nobody has come by my table and I'm really hungry and thirsty and I have an appointment I have to get to. And so could you guys help me out? Come on. And so you're a little maybe rude or brash or aggressive. And so you might be effective. They might roll their eyes and come over and take your order, but they're not happy about it. Appropriateness is how you become effective within the confines and the expectations of that given situation. And when we do that, we realize that competence is an interpersonal assessment. So I don't get to judge my own competence solely. The person I'm interacting with is also judging my level of competence. And so to the extent that both members of an interaction or all parties of an interaction are satisfied with how that interaction took place and they thought it was appropriate and effective, then it is competent. So remember that you aren't the one that solely who gets to judge intercultural competence, but that other person is judging you as well. So what you do, how you behave, is the basis on which other people will determine your intercultural competence. So let's look at what some of the barriers are to intercultural competence before we move into those 5 aptitudes. In an intercultural competence or in an intercultural setting, sometimes we can assume that the culture will be similar to us. And that's usually our default, is that people are people and they'll be like me in some way. And so we assume similarity instead of difference, and that can be a problem. Also, it could be a language problem. If our language capacity in that first language of that culture is not very good, then that could be the issue, that we're having problems just communicating our needs and wants in the situation. Sometimes it's a nonverbal misunderstanding. I mentioned that some cultures have proxemic differences. You stand closer in some cultures and more distant in other cultures. And every culture has a norm. When we're talking about communication behaviors, we're often talking about what is normative in that culture, and do we know the norms? Are we abiding by those norms? And there are all kinds of nonverbal, we'll talk more about those at the end of this lesson, but there are all kinds of nonverbal misunderstandings that can confuse the situation and cause a lack of competence. Sometimes it's ideas we bring into the situation with us, preconceptions about that culture or that people group, stereotypes and prejudices that we might have. And sometimes it's just that almost innate bias that we have inside of us, our tendency to evaluate others. We're always judging others, and we're usually doing it by our own standard. Within our own frame, we judge people and their actions based upon our own expectations. And that's fairly logical and normal, but it's something we have to work through and avoid doing when we're in another cultural setting, because the rules of the table are different in this culture. We have to remember that. Sometimes we're under stress. We're under that language stress. We're in a new country situation, and it's hard to get along. There's a lot of pressure on us, and we may not realize that pressure, but it kind of builds, it mounts the longer we're in that setting and the harder we have to work. And it kind of wears on you. And so there can be high anxiety and stress when you don't know what's going on. It's about uncertainty, right? We like to be able to cope, and part of the way we cope is by reducing the uncertainty in a situation. And in a cross-cultural setting, intercultural setting, there's a lot of uncertainty. And then sometimes it's just lacking the appropriate intercultural skills in that setting. And again, the longer we're in that setting, the more opportunity we have to gain those skills, and so we can become more competent. What are the options that this young man has in the restaurant? The first thing is he could show a little bit or work on a little bit of cultural empathy, trying to understand what's going on at the restaurant, maybe from the standpoint of the server. Maybe it is normative for those servers to come by the table and greet the person when they sit down. Maybe they're super busy at that restaurant at that time. But we first need to try to figure out what's happening in that cultural situation. How do those people feel? What are their thoughts? What's the normative behavior? And that's where the sitting back and observing and just watching what's happening at other tables. How do other tables seem to be getting the server's attention? So we could work on cultural empathy. And this is arguably the most important aptitude, is cultural empathy. And empathy is different from sympathy in that sympathy it starts from a place of similarity. We assume similarity with someone. So when somebody loses a relative and you come up to them and say, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I lost my own relative such and such a time, and I know how you feel," right? So I know how hard it is. Empathy is different in that empathy starts from a position of difference. I don't assume that I know what's going on in this situation. I have to explore your position. But empathy begins with trying to understand what's going on. I first recognize I don't know what you're feeling and what you're thinking and what the right action is, course of behavior here. So I'm going to start by trying to explore that. Then I can take a little bit of social initiative, and I have to decide how much social initiative. So this is an active stance. This is maybe where I get up and go contact the server and say, "I'm sorry, I've never been here before. I'm wondering how I can place my order." And then sometimes open-mindedness, just understanding that things might be done a little bit differently here, and I need to be open and unprejudiced about this culture and the way that they do things. So maybe the way the servers behave toward their customers, it's a little bit different than what I'm used to, but that's the way it's done here, and I need to be open-minded about that. It's not the job of a server in many cultures to become your friend. And so you don't expect that warmth and kind of engagement at the table. And then flexibility is the fifth aptitude. Sometimes we need to pivot, and we have to be willing to venture into maybe areas of discomfort of our own and adjust given the situation, maybe act differently or respond differently. So flexibility in engaging other cultures is really key as well. And personally, leading many, many teams abroad, empathy and flexibility, if somebody possesses a great deal of those two aptitudes, they're going to be a winner on that team. That's going to be somebody I'm going to lean on as a leader, somebody I'm going to rely on to help me bring other people along, is somebody who has a lot of empathy and flexibility. So they're usually people that are going to also have more of this fifth aptitude, and that is emotional stability. So that's when things change, when your expectations aren't met, sometimes people can melt down. And so emotional stability is the ability to remain calm and deal with situations in a level-headed manner. And crossing cultures can be stressful. So the ability to have a lot of emotional stability is really important. So these 5 aptitudes are things that you will be working on in your engagement with your cultural experience. And you've been measured on these in the pre-assessment. You'll be measured on these 5 aptitudes in the post-assessment. And then you'll be able to explore not only your subjective understanding of how you think you improved, but we'll have some hard social science data from those instruments that you can look at your scores and see how you've changed. So let's apply those 5 aptitudes to another scenario, and then you decide what should happen. Given those 5 aptitudes, what should this person do? And after you watch this scenario, I encourage you maybe pause the video for a second and think about, okay, what's the right course of action here?
You have been studying in a foreign country for a while. One evening after class, You are invited by some friends to come over and watch a movie at their house. You bring some drinks as a way of contributing to the evening. However, after the film, you are surprised to be asked to pay a contribution to the rental of the film, even though you brought drinks for everyone. What do you do?
All right. So pause and then think about that and ask yourself, what would you do in terms of empathy and social initiative and open-mindedness and flexibility and emotional stability? Assuming that you've had some time to think about that, certainly empathy here is a key. You need to understand, well, this is this culture setting and I'm unfamiliar with it, and this is the way they do it in this setting. But also a little social initiative might also be in order, because you could just ask, hey, I was unaware that everybody would be bringing money to help with the rental of the film. And obviously this is an older scenario, that what they popped out of that television set was a videotape. Many of you may not be familiar with those. That's the way that films used to come from places like Blockbuster Video. You would go and rent cassette tapes like that. Very few. I think the last Blockbuster finally went out of business. But those rental fees might be shared in a group setting like that, and you could just inquire, I brought drinks and paid for those myself, and I'm wondering in the future if that could be my contribution. That is a little risky because you don't know these people super well, but it does show a little bit of social initiative. And if you can say it or ask it in the form of a question of, hey, I'm trying to learn what the norms are in this culture, they may give you a pass because you are new and, oh yeah, well, you brought the drinks, so that can be your contribution. But it's the form of, again, curiosity, which suggests empathy. I'm trying to understand how you guys, your culture works, and how I can best kind of join in. And then you could also think of it as a chance to improve that emotional stability and open-mindedness. Oh, okay, that's a little different. I've been invited to watch this film, and I thought with the invitation that I wouldn't be expected to pay, but it's a little bit different here. And so being open-mindedness and non-judgmental about that will also help. And frankly, how much money is it going to be, right? Your share of 6 or 8 people who are watching this film together. So all of those aptitudes will come into play in every scenario. It's not like one aptitude might be featured, like it might require a little bit more of one of those aptitudes than another, but all of them usually are going to be woven in to a competent response. And so every scenario you want to think about, okay, how can I be more empathetic, be open-minded, be flexible, have a little bit of social initiative, enough but not too much perhaps, and then show enough or work on my emotional stability so I don't freak out, and I'm going to be able to remain calm even if things go, take an unexpected turn. So the factors that influence your ICC are your ability in the host language and your understanding of the culture. The knowledge you bring with you obviously is going to play in to being more competent in that culture. And your motivation to adapt, your motivation to understand that culture and engage with that culture. If you have no motivation, then your competence is going to wane. You're going to be less competent if you're not driven to succeed in that culture. And that positive attitude toward the host culture is going to be demonstrated by that motivation to adapt. So motivation and that positive attitude kind of go together. And then the skills that allow you to participate in those host networks, those social networks, those are going to be, the skills are going to be the behavioral element. So you might understand a little bit of the host language and how to greet somebody or thank them for spending time. So let's say I'm in the Karen culture here in St. Paul, and I'm leaving the family after spending some time at their home, and I want to say thank you. So I've learned the word tableau, to say thank you in Karen. And I learned how to extend my arm and shake the hand the way the Karen do. So I have a little bit of that host knowledge of language and culture, and I'm integrating and participating in the host network and in relationships in that culture. And so that's the blend between knowledge and to be able to enact that in a skill all of that goes together in influencing your ICC, or your intercultural communication competence. So you can see it's a combination of knowledge, motivation, and skills that are going to make you more competent. Now, we also know that engaging in host mass media, the cultural mass media, is going to help you acquire some of those skills. So there's what you can do yourself in person, but also watching it and seeing how it's done in media, and listening to the host language media is going to be really helpful in increasing your ICC. When we become competent, one of the things that does for us is it improves our communication skills. It's going to help us engage in meaningful dialogue. We're going to be able to initiate conversations and interaction. We're going to be able to cope or deal with misunderstandings when those happen. And we're going to be able to deal with different communication styles. Their communication style might not be similar to your personal style. So let's look at some of the verbal styles that can be different across cultures. The first is direct versus indirect. And certainly in the US, we lean more toward the direct end of this verbal style. We have slogans or sayings like "just spit it out," or "don't beat around the bush," "get to the point." And what we want is people to say, be direct in what they mean. And a more indirect style, which is very common in honor-shame cultures or collectivistic cultures or high context cultures that we've learned about, they tend to be more indirect and veil what they're really after in a conversation, especially in conflict, right? A high context collectivistic culture, honor-shame culture, is going to veil their true feelings in a conflict situation where they find you problematic, or they're mad at you. They're going to do it indirectly. They're going to say things indirectly. Minnesota passive-aggressive style is a little bit of that indirect style. Then there's the elaborate, succinct dichotomy. So elaborate communication styles tend to say more, they embellish, they're more colorful, they might use metaphorical expressions, whereas a succinct style is going to be understated. They might use silence more. They might have shorter units of expression, so they're not going to be as elaborate. They're not going to say as much when they're speaking. Then the personal versus contextual. Personal, think of this as the formality or informality of a situation, and so a more personal style is going to be more informal, less status oriented. It's going to be more individuated in terms of the conversation. Contextual is going to rely more on status, social roles. It's going to be more formal. And so that you might, for instance, you go to a meeting or a dinner party, and where people sit in a contextual style is going to be really important. You're going to have the most honored people will get very specific seats and next to each other, and where you're seated kind of conveys your importance in the hierarchy. Instrumental affective has to do with emotional versus, say, task-oriented or goal-oriented. So the instrumental style is somebody who is more task focused and goal-oriented in their style. Affective is you're going to be more aware of the emotional undertones of the situation, more sensitivity to how things are said as opposed to just saying it, right? So that instrumental affective emotion, it's maybe think of it as emotional intelligence, or the acuity of the emotional content in what you're saying. Organizational preference has to do with the way talk happens, the organization of talk. So whether, put it into a speaking scenario where you're giving a speech, do you have to be linear? How clear do you have to be? What are your topic units? How separated do those have to be? Whereas in a more vague or circular or multiplicity of topics, that's going to be a somewhat different organizational preference. And then the value of silence. So the value of talk over silence which the U.S. tends to fall into by and large, aside from Native American cultures, versus the value of silence over talk. So all of those are different verbal styles that you might confront. But then there's the nonverbal aspect of our interaction. So let's watch this little clip, and you can see maybe in a humorous way how nonverbals can be really important in cultural interaction.
Ciao, Sophia.
Sorry.
Niente.
Sorry.
In Italy, different flowers have different meanings. Chrysanthemums, for example, are associated with funerals and sadness. At HSBC, we never underestimate the importance of local knowledge.
The English believe it's a slur on your host's food if you don't clear your plate. Whereas the Chinese feel you're questioning their generosity if you do. At HSBC, we never underestimate the importance of local knowledge. Which is why we have local banks staffed by local people in over 80 countries across the globe. HSBC, the world's local bank.
So you can see non-verbally, there are all kinds of variables that can come into play and make, I think, interaction across cultures really fun. But it keeps you on your toes, right? You can have differences in the meaning and use of silence. Does silence communicate something? And certainly it does even in U.S. culture. We call it the silent treatment, right? Silence communicates differently in every culture. Paralanguage. It's not what you say, but how you say it. And certainly we have those understandings in U.S. Culture and the use of English. But paralanguage, the rules of how you say things and what that means, how loudly you speak, how quickly you speak. And sometimes when we hear conversations in languages we're unfamiliar with, we can think that they're fighting or angry with each other. They're not. It's just differences in paralanguage. Differences in time are some of the nonverbal components that actually trip us up sometimes the most and first, because we don't understand the use of time. And time is thought of differently. As we talked about in the cultural frameworks lesson, time is thought of differently in every culture. Facial expressions, or kinesics, which is gestures and body posture. Environmental and artifacts are a form of nonverbal. How do we communicate within our spaces by the way we design our spaces, the things we have on the walls? What are we saying about ourselves? The use of eye contact or touch. And proxemics, as I said, was the use of space, different distances. And some cultures have more social distance than others. Some cultures are what we call high contact or low contact, meaning high touch or low touch cultures. So nonverbals are going to be one of the things that'll be fun for you to observe in your other culture and the culture that you're engaging, and take a lot of journal notes about that, or maybe snap a few pictures very discreetly to kind of show differences in space or body posture or orientation that you observe. And we're looking for normative behaviors. Certainly different people will have idiosyncratic expressions, but we're looking for what are some standards, some norms across that culture that you're observing. If we engage in competent communication across cultures, what we are hoping to achieve are what are called isomorphic attributions. And it really helps us to deal with stress in that culture or to engage in meaningful personal relationships in that culture, which is your objective in your intercultural engagement. And so that isomorphic attribution means we're able to say about a situation and about a piece of communication or an interaction, what that other culture would say about it, right? We attribute the same meaning to an event or a behavior that they would. And as those two attributions line up, we have what we call an isomorphic attribution. And then we're going to be able to move through that culture and navigate that culture more competently if we do that. So take a moment and reflect on some of these ideas and the information that was just presented, and ask yourself what you know now that you didn't know coming in, and how these ideas might push you and your thinking in new directions. And we will see you in the next lesson.